We've been covering the epistle to the Galatians and working that in correspondence with the records in the book of Acts that deal with those same events. And where we left off in our study was just after they being Paul and Barnabas, had been to the council in Jerusalem, where they all came together with all the leadership to address this issue of what Paul had been preaching, that they no longer needed to be under the law, and the Gentiles also were just as welcomed and had all of the same rights and standing of anyone else, of the Judeans, that it was one body. Although that wasn't specifically necessarily completely revealed at that point. The idea of being one body and all fullness of the mystery. And they went from there to Antioch after they thought they had this matter settled once and for all. That everybody there was in agreement, that everybody agreed that just as Peter had seen the household of Cornelius come in, as Paul had been teaching about what had been happening and the signs, miracles, and wonders that had confirmed that, they all had reached an agreement that they did not need to try to put Gentiles under the law in any manner. Not circumcision, nothing at all. That was what was decided. They sent Paul and Barnabas to Antioch, along with a couple of other disciples or leaders, their prophets, that had been at that meeting, to establish these findings, along with letters from James and Peter and the others saying, this is what we've all agreed upon. And they went to Antioch, and they were there for some time, and after being there for some time, then Paul and Barnabas are going to go back out on the road. They're going to go back to all those places they had been to before going to Jerusalem, those regions in Galatia and that lower area of Asia Minor, and they were going to go back and see how all the believers were doing and confirm what they had taught them. And as they're about to head out, Paul and Barnabas have a difference of opinion about what they should do because of one of the particular guys that had been with them before, by the name of John Mark. And just to recap it quickly from reading it, look, you can go to Galatians chapter, no, I take that back, Acts chapter 15 in verse 36. Is that what I am? And some days after, Paul said unto Barnabas, let us go again and visit our brethren in every city where we have preached the word of the Lord and see how they do. And Barnabas determined to take with them John, whose surname was Mark. But Paul thought not good to take him with them, who departed from them from Pamphylia, and went not with them to the work. And the contention was so sharp between them that they departed asunder, one from the other. And so Barnabas took Mark and sailed unto Cyprus, and Paul chose Silas and departed, being recommended by the brethren unto the grace of God, and he went through Syria and Cilicia, confirming the churches. So that's where Paul and Barnabas split company, where they part ways. And it's actually the last you really hear of Barnabas in the record. But interestingly, it's not the last you hear of Mark. Paul goes out with instead Silas, and they continue moving the word, and that's what the record in Acts follows, and it's what the church epistles follow. And that's where the significant work continues to be done. But why? Why the split? And what was the problem with John Mark? It says that John Mark left them in Pamphylia, that he did not go with them. And because of that Paul was not willing to take him again. But does that mean that was the end of John Mark's life and ministry? Does that mean that he never did anything for God again? No. In fact, it turns out that John Mark is the Mark that wrote one of the Gospels. You know, it's clear, what is clear from the record in Acts, is that this was not a right thing that John Mark had done when he left them in the lurch, so to speak, back in Pamphylia. But that doesn't mean that people can't recognize and recover from something. The only one in the Bible that never made a mistake was Jesus Christ. Paul makes a mistake later on. Everyone makes mistakes. And in life, everybody makes mistakes. None of us ever do it perfectly. We strive for perfection. We strive to be Christ-like. But we have to be able to live with the fact that we're going to fall short still. We're still going to fall short, and that's why we need God's forgiveness and His mercy and grace. Paul knew about mercy and grace. He knew about forgiveness. His decision to not take John Mark with him couldn't have been one of not being willing to forgive, because Paul was always so aware of what God had forgiven him for. But nonetheless, it's clear that it wasn't the right thing to do. And you see in the life of Paul, and in this situation and the other things surrounding it, that when Paul was convinced that something was right, he didn't compromise. He didn't give in. Here, as much as he loved Barnabas, as much as he respected Barnabas, he's convinced that this is not right, and he's just not willing to do it. Barnabas perhaps looked on the whole thing on a more just human level than a spiritual level in that situation. But we'll look a little bit at more about John Mark and who he was and his relationship to Barnabas. You can turn to Acts chapter 12, which is the first mention in Acts 12 of John Mark. In Acts 12, verse 12, it says, "And when he," speaking of Peter, "had considered the thing, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying." Now, if you know the record, the context, what's just happened and why everybody was at Mary's house praying was because Peter has been in prison. James, not the James that was at the Council of Jerusalem, but another James, was recently killed by Herod. And then right on the heels of that, Peter was thrown in prison, and the plan was to have him suffer the same fate. He was supposed to die in the morning. But an angel wakes him up, and he wakes him up enough for him to get out of there. He's not fully awake until sometime later. But he goes to the house of Mary, where all the disciples have been gathered together praying for his release. And it's a fun record, you know. That's the one where there they are. They're all doing the praying. I'm not sure who was doing the believing, because when he gets there and he calls outside the gate, and that little girl, what was her name? Rhoda, I thought so. Rhoda answers the door, and then she goes and runs in and tells everybody that Peter's outside calling. They think that she's crazy. So again, I'm not sure who was doing the believing in the situation. They are all praying. Nonetheless, this Mary, whose house it is, she's the mother of John Mark. She is the mother of John Mark, and that's the first mention of him. In verse 25 of chapter 12, it says then, "And Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their ministry." That ministry was the one where they had taken the abundant sharing, the relief offering for the saints in Jerusalem because of the famine that had been going on and that Agabus had told them about. They had gone there to take that, and when they had finished that, they took with them John, whose surname was Mark. So this is when he, John Mark, first joins them in doing anything. And then you go from there to chapter 13 and verse 5. "And when they were at Salamis, they preached the word of God in the synagogues of the Jews. And they had also John to their minister. So now we know that John was not only with them, but he was helping to serve them, helping to do the work, and helping specifically to take care of them. Look at verse 13. Now, when Paul and his company loosed from Paphos, they came to Perga in Pamphylia, and John, departing from them, returned to Jerusalem. So that's where he leaves them. When they're at that place, and he goes back home. He goes back home. But, as I said, it's not the last you hear of John Mark, or Mark as he's more commonly known from that point on. Look at Colossians chapter 4. Colossians chapter 4, verse 10. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, saluteth you. Okay, let me give you just a little context here. This epistle to the Colossians, Paul wrote while he was in prison. This is where he has been in prison. He's been in prison now since he does make a wrong decision to go back to Jerusalem. And he's in prison and he's awaiting trial. And this is at that time that he writes a number of the epistles, Colossians being one of them. And he says that one of his fellow prisoners gave his greetings, and Marcus, also Mark, okay, one's the Greek and the other one's the other form of it, sister's son to Barnabas, touching whom ye received commandments, if he come unto you, receive him. And Jesus, which is called Justus, who are of the circumcision. These only are my fellow workers unto the kingdom of God, which have been a comfort unto me. So there's just a handful of guys at this point in time that Paul says have been working with him and that are a comfort to him. Just a few, just a few. And amongst that small few is Mark. Mark, who obviously at one time, Paul wasn't too pleased with what he had done. But here he is much, much later in Paul's ministry, and he's one of the ones that's still faithful. And obviously, nobody's holding any grudges at this point, right? By the way, that phrase in the King James Version, Marcus, sister's son to Barnabas. Well, sister's son to us would mean that, if you think that one through, that Mark would have been Barnabas' nephew. But every other translation has it cousin. Every other translation, including the Literals According to Usage and Walter Cummins' translation. And going into the Greek, although that Greek word can be also translated niece or nephew, it believed by most that it is more accurately cousin. It's the only place it's used in this verse is the only place where that word's used in the Bible too. Look at 2 Timothy chapter 4. 2 Timothy is the church in ruin. This is very much the end of Paul's ministry. This is past the time of writing Colossians and Ephesians and Philemon. This is the very end, and Paul's still in prison. But at this point, he talks about in 2 Timothy that basically all they that be of Asia Minor have turned away from him. That everybody's just walked away. And in chapter 4, verse 11, he says, only Luke is with me. Take Mark and bring him with thee, for he is profitable to me for the ministry. So quite a comeback on Mark's part, isn't it? Besides understanding more of the record of what's going on here at the time, it's also great to see the end and to follow it through. And to see the relationships and recognize that, sometimes you read a verse and you read something about someone in one place, but if you start putting it together with other records, these people become more real to you. You see the relationships, you see the family, you see the working relationships. And you see at times in those working relationships that not everything always goes smoothly. In the household of believers, there's not always perfect harmony. Should be. But that's just not life, because the household of God is made up of the individual believers, and none of us are perfect. But that's why all the more we always have to be kind and loving and forgiving and never compromising on the truth, but always willing to forgive and help somebody find their way back if they want it. Well, let's go now to Galatians chapter 2. So, in Galatians, we'd been reading where in the first 10 verses of Galatians, he's recounted what has happened with the Council of Jerusalem. And then he talks about how they went to Antioch. In verse 11, it says, "But when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face because he was to be blamed." So, this is just a short time after the Council of Jerusalem. This is before Paul and Barnabas leave, or to go their separate ways, but before they head out. And while they're still there in Antioch, Peter comes down to see them. And when he does, Paul says that he withstood him to the face because he was to be blamed. Withstood him to the face means he confronted him, and he confronted him strongly. He reproved Peter because Peter was doing something wrong. Now, again, think about, from a human standpoint, what that must have been like for Paul. This is Peter. This is Peter. This is Peter, who was in this thing long before he was, while Paul was still out there having Christians arrested and put on trial and consenting to their death. Peter had been the guy. He'd been the man from the day of Pentecost on. Him and James were still the top leaders. But Paul didn't care about a person's position. Didn't mean that he didn't respect them. But he knew that God was not a respecter of persons, and neither was he. And when Peter was off, just like later when Barnabas gets off, Paul does not compromise on it. He doesn't compromise for the sake of friendships, for the sake of relationships, for the sake of anything when it comes to the truth. When Peter was to be blamed, he withstood him to the face. Verse 12. Here's the issue. "For before that certain came from James, he did eat with the Gentiles." So Peter was down there and hanging out with Paul and Barnabas and all the other people there, all the Gentiles that are now believers. He's hanging out with all of them, and he's perfectly happy to be with them. Perfectly happy to be under the same roof. Perfectly happy to be sitting at the table and having food with them. But when those guys that came from James came, but when they were come, continuing verse 12, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision. So, once these guys from Jerusalem come, now he's not willing to sit at the same table with these guys. He's not willing to sit at the same tables with the Gentiles. He gets up and goes in the other room. He separates himself from them. Why? Why? It says, fearing them which were of the circumcision. Peter left and did something he knew that they had already agreed that this was perfectly fine, but now he's not willing to take part in it because he fears those that were of the circumcision. Hard to believe, isn't it? Here's Peter. Peter, who on the day of Pentecost, his opening lines are, you crucified Jesus Christ and God raised him from the dead. This is just 50 days after they had crucified Jesus Christ. Less than 2 months later, he's pointing fingers in their face. Peter, who, when he was told time and time again not to preach the name of Jesus Christ, his answer is, we ought to obey God rather than men. You want to beat us? Beat us. So Peter doesn't strike you as the kind of fella that was, at this point in his life, too afraid about what people could do to him. But that's not the kind of type of fear that is playing on his mind. He's fearing what they're going to think. He's fearing how they're going to react. And a lot of times, the same people that will stand up and face any kind of physical danger, they can be intimidated by the more subtle psychological. Worried about what people think. That can be a big one. Worried about what people think. So often, too often, people get so concerned about what other people think that they're willing to compromise on what they believe. But not Peter. Peter didn't compromise on what he believed. Peter did compromise. Paul didn't compromise on what he believed. Peter did. Peter knew that this was not a right thing he was doing. And Paul doesn't just say, well, that's too bad. No, he confronts him. Verse 13. And the other Jews dissembled likewise with him. Not only did Peter get up from the table and leave, but all the other Jews, now believers, but Jewish and Judeans in background, they also leave. Insomuch that, who? Barnabas also was carried away with their dissimulation. That word dissimulation comes from the Greek word hypocrisis. Anybody guess what word we get from that one? Hypocrisy. And that's exactly what it was. Hypocrisy. Hypocrisy. Hypocrites. Hypocrites. They knew better. They knew it was perfectly fine. Peter knew it was perfectly fine for them to be eating with them. But there they are. They get up and leave. And it's affecting everybody. When you're somebody like Peter and you compromise, it's not just your stand. It's not just your life that's getting hurt by it. It's affecting everybody else that respects you. Everybody else. If you are a leader and you compromise on the truth, that is going to have a major impact on everyone that has any kind of respect for you. And to compromise always breeds more compromise. It always breeds more compromise. Verse 14. But when I saw that they walked not uprightly according to the truth of the gospel, I said unto Peter before them all. Why before them all? Why didn't he take Peter in the other room? Why didn't he just quietly, handle it individually? Exactly. And that's the difference, If this had been something that Peter had been off the ball on, and it wasn't something that everybody saw and was following, then he could have handled it just privately. But once something's affecting other people, then he had no choice. He had to reprove him so that people didn't think it was okay. I said unto Peter before them all, if thou, being a Jew, livest after the manner of Gentiles, and not as do the Jews, why compellest thou the Gentiles to live as do the Jews? If you, as a Judean who had been under the law, now are living like the Gentiles who were never under the law, why are you trying to take the Gentiles and put them under the law that you couldn't live under yourself? We, who are Jews by nature and not sinners of the Gentiles, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ, even we have believed in Jesus Christ, that we might be justified by the faith of Jesus Christ, and not by the works of the law, for by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. Boy, 3 or 4 times in that one verse, it says we are not justified by the works of the law. 3 or 4 times just in that one single verse of Scripture. Look at that for a figure of repetition, figure of speech of repetition. Look how God is driving this point. Look how strong this point is being made. And here he's relating what happened back when they were in Antioch to the Galatians now to make it a point to them, to make them see that it doesn't matter who's telling you this. It doesn't matter how important they might seem. It doesn't matter how much respect you may have had for them at some point in time. Here I was in a room with the great apostle Peter. And when he started to do those things that would affect others and put them under the law, I withstood him to the face. And I told him so clearly, again and again, we are not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ. Boy, you would think that, they could have just said right there, give my greetings to the rest of the fellas, and that's the end of the epistle. Because it's right there, as clear can be, that we are not justified by the works of the law. It's not by what we do. It's not by following the law. It's not by anything except what Jesus Christ did for us. Let's continue. Verse 17. But if while we seek to be justified by Christ, we ourselves also are found sinners, is therefore Christ the minister of sin? God forbid. For if I build again the things which I destroyed, I make myself a transgressor. For I, through the law, am dead to the law, that I may live unto Christ. I, through the law, am dead to the law. How is he, through the law, dead to the law? Because Jesus Christ fulfilled the law. That the law required that somebody did come and completely obey God. And this then goes back, and remember, this is correcting the error that crept in from not adhering to Romans. And Romans lays this all out in even greater detail than what's being said in Galatians. Galatians reminds them of the truth and says it very straight and blunt and hard. But Romans just carefully lays out that case so painstakingly. Romans so shows that by one man's disobedience, Adam, many became sinners. By one man's obedience, Jesus Christ, many became righteous. That it's not that according to the law, by that standard, everyone is found guilty. Everyone's worthy of death. There is none righteous, no, not one. And that the law says these things to conclude that all may be found guilty before God. But then God justified us through Jesus Christ and what he did. It is as clear can be. God could not have said this any plainer, any more direct. And yet, here even Peter at the time is allowing himself to get talked out of it. And so many have. Again and again in the history of Christianity. Dead to the law, this whole thing of if I sin, then what? That grace, that righteousness, it's not given to us so that then we can respond to it by saying, well, then I can just live like the devil. It's not my works. I don't have to follow the law. I can do anything and I'm still going to heaven. And that's true. But that's not why God gave his son, so that we could have that attitude. But when we recognize that grace, then we live worthy of it. All right, let's see if I can finish this quickly. I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live. Yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. That's what it's all about. The life that we now live, we live for Christ. We live it because we so appreciate what he did for us. Look at the next verse. Here's where we'll close. I do not frustrate the grace of God, for if righteousness cometh by the law, then Christ is dead in vain. So that's what you say. You put yourself under the law, that's what you're saying. You're saying that Jesus Christ died for nothing. He died for nothing. And everybody that ever wants to put you under the law, anybody that ever decides to do that, and I don't know why men want to be under the law so much, but when they do, that's what they're saying, that Christ did not accomplish a thing. But he did.